Welcome back to lesson 3 of our course, in which we will be learning about some basic music theory concepts and ideas about relationships between chords. These will help us make better sense of the music we are playing and also understand what is going on in it on a deeper level. While certain aspects of music theory can get quite abstract, this lesson will keep things relatively simple. Do not skip it, as in it we will be learning some chords that we will require for our future lessons. Now, did you notice that in a lot of the examples we've played so far, the chord G or G7 is almost always followed by a C major chord? If not, go back and take a look at all the exercises we've done so far. This happens in every single one, including the last optional exercise. Why do you think that is? The answer to that is quite simple, but the underlying reasons that make it so can get a little more complicated. Before we answer it, let's examine some basic concepts of harmony, the study of chords and how they interact with each other. Now, much like guitar playing in itself, harmony is an entire discipline to which we could dedicate entire courses. However, in this lesson, we are going to do a relatively surface-level dive into it. Now, chords can have a number of functions in music theory, but the most important ones are the 3 that we will be looking at in this lesson. Keep in mind that everything I talk about in this lesson applies to tonal music from what is generally known as the common practice era. This does not apply to music from all time periods and anywhere around the world. Okay, so what are these 3 most important functions? Well, chords can have what is known as tonic function. A chord in tonic function, or a chord that has tonic function, feels very stable, like it doesn't want to go anywhere, feels very comfortable where it is. When we are in the key of C major, for example, the chord C major has tonic function. It is always the one that gives the name to the key we are in, and it is also positioned on the so-called first scale degree of any key. Before we move on, though, you might be wondering, what are those scale degrees I speak of? Well, every key has a scale of 7 notes associated with it. And as you know, once you go through all of these 7 notes, they simply repeat themselves over and over again. Let's take an example just to clarify. The scale of A minor has the notes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. What is above the G? Another A, as we've mentioned. It's a cycle that repeats itself in both directions with no theoretical limit on any side. There are limits to what our human ears can perceive, but there's no limit to the number of A's you can conceive of theoretically. Let's take another example. The key of C major begins on a C and contains the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B. After that, the cycle simply repeats itself. The point is, the first note of the scale is the one that gives it its name. That is called the first scale degrees, and every other note after that has a number associated with it. Second note has scale degree 2, 3, 4, and so on. These scale degrees are generally notated with Roman numerals ranging from 1 to 7. Some of those will be capital letters, and some of those will be written with lowercase letters, but why that is a topic for another day. Okay, so now that we've looked at tonic function, which is the most basic of them all, let's also take a quick look at the other 2 important chord functions within any key. The 5th scale degree of any key, also known as the dominant, has dominant function. Dominant function is very unstable and characterized by a very strong tendency to resolve to the tonic. We will explain more about what this means in a minute. By simply counting up from the tonic until we reach the 5th scale degree, we can identify the dominant of any single key. Let's try it in the key of C major. C, D, E, F, and G. The dominant of C major is G. If we are in the key of C major and we play a G major chord, especially in its G7 form, but not necessarily, this will have an extremely strong tendency to resolve back to the tonic. That move that we've just witnessed from G7 to C major is called resolution. Knowing that some chords are more tense than others and want to resolve into something else, want to release that tension into a chord that is less tense, that is the process we call resolution. Now that we've established what dominant function is, let's just really quickly go over some of the other things that can happen within a key. The most important one of those being that if there's a chord that resolves into the dominant rather than into the tonic, we call that a predominant function chord. The most common one that fulfills this purpose is the fourth scale degree of any key, which is called a subdominant. Subdominant because it is below the dominant, and it has predominant function because it resolves into the dominant. For now, just keep in mind the tonic is on the first scale degree of every key, the subdominant is on the fourth scale degree, and the dominant is on the fifth scale degree. Knowing this, the first exercise you are going to have to do in this lesson does not consist of playing chords, but rather of identifying the subdominant and dominant chords within certain keys. This is, in fact, quite a simple task. Remember that notes, musical notes, go from A to G, and that the note that gives a key its name is always the first scale degree of that key. So as an example, if we want to identify the dominant of D, we just call D a 1, and we count up from that note. D, E, F, G, A. The dominant of D major is A. Do this for exercise 3A. Answers to that exercise will be provided in the accompanying PDF. Now, for the rest of the lesson, let's learn some more chords. Remember that, as we've just seen, there are always multiple ways to play a single chord on the guitar. However, the ones that we will be learning here are some of the most basic ones, also known as open chords sometimes. Some people call these open chords, a name that I believe can be somewhat misleading, but it is important to know about it. If you've already played some guitar before starting this course, you might be familiar with some of these. Let's start with the simplest one, E major. Now, knowing the things about guitar playing that you already know, including where the notes are positioned within the first few frets of the guitar, and what a sharp does to a certain note, you should be able to read this chord by yourself. Just to make sure there are no mistakes though, let's go through those together. We have a low E at the bottom, which is an open string, the sixth open string, followed by a low B, which we'll be playing with the second finger on our fifth string second fret. Then that will be followed by another E on the fourth string, played with the third finger in the second fret. And the G sharp. The G natural would be an open string. However, the G sharp is one fret above the G natural. We'll be playing that with our first finger on the third string first fret, followed by two open strings, the open B and the open E. As you can see, I've played this chord with my thumb going from the bass to the top note. All the chords in this lesson can be played this way. In fact, the squiggly line next to the chord tells you that this is the way they are intended to be performed. Not as a fast strum, but taking your time to really enjoy every note. Congratulations! You've just learned a new chord. Add E major to your arsenal. Now, for the next chord, A minor, knowing what you already know about the guitar, you should be able to also read this by yourself. However, I am here to give you a few tips. The great thing about this chord is that from the point of view of your left hand, it is basically identical to an E major, except all the fingers are positioned exactly one string higher. So, from here, we go here. Let's go through it note by note. You have an open E in the bass, followed by an open A on the 5th string, another E on the 4th string 2nd fret, another A on the 3rd string 2nd fret, a C on the 2nd string 1st fret, and another open E at the top. So although these chords fulfill very different roles from a music theoretical point of view, for us as guitarists, it is quite easy to alternate between them. This will come in very handy, among other things, for our final piece of this course, Tárregas Malagueña Fácil. Okay, moving on to the next chord, we have a D major. This is quite interesting for a number of different reasons, one of which being that it does not include the 6th string. That means when playing this chord, make sure you start by positioning your thumb on your 5th string and going down from there, rather than starting on a 6th string. The other interesting reason why this chord is special is that none of your fingers will be playing anything in the 1st fret, which technically means we are in our 2nd position of our left hand. This will become more important later. For now, just keep that in mind, and let's read the chord together. Starting from the bottom, we have an open A on the 5th string, followed by an open D on the 4th string, another A on the 3rd string 2nd fret, which we'll be playing with our 1st finger, another D on our 2nd string 3rd fret, which we'll be playing with our 3rd finger, and finally, on the top string, we have an F sharp. Now, as we know, a sharp changes the note by making it 1 fret higher than it would regularly be. Our normal F would be on the 1st fret of the 1st string. However, in this case, because we have an F sharp, we'll be playing that on the 2nd fret with our 2nd finger. So the full chord will sound like this. Again, make sure not to play the 6th string with this chord, as that will make it sound bad. For now, while learning these chords, just focus on playing them properly, making the notes sound, letting the open strings ring, and just really producing beautiful sounds. Don't worry too much about switching between them at this point. This will come later. All right, now the great thing about our next chord is that we already know it. It is a C major chord that we have already known before we even started this course. But feel free to check the notes on the paper and read them one by one. The way you would play this with your thumb, using all the open string, would be something like this. The same can be said about our next chord, which we have also already learned, albeit in a slightly different version. Let's think back to our exercises from lesson 1, in which we had this G major with 2 fingers, a low G on the 6th string 3rd fret, and a high G on the 1st string 3rd fret. For this version that we are encountering now, we have to add one more finger into the mix. That will be our middle finger, which will go to the B on the 5th string 2nd fret of the guitar. All the other strings are actually open strings, so as soon as you've added that finger in, you already have the entire chord. It will sound like this. All right, and for our last chord, this is another one we have not had before. This is called the B7, and like I said, we will explain later what this 7 stands for. In the meantime, let's read the notes, and let's start by noticing that this is another 5-string chord, meaning we will not be playing anything on the 6th string of the guitar. All right, reading the notes one by one, we start with a B on the 5th string 2nd fret, played with a 2nd finger, followed by a D sharp. A D sharp would obviously be 1 fret higher than a D natural. The D natural would be an open string. In this case, as a D sharp, we play this in our 1st fret with our 1st finger. This is followed by an A on the 3rd string 2nd fret, which we will play with the 3rd finger. An open B, which will be on the 2nd string. And another F sharp, just like we had in D major before, on the 2nd fret of the 1st string, played with the only finger we have left, the fourth. This chord will sound like this. Great, now that we've gone through all the chords in this exercise, let's focus on playing them as smoothly and beautifully as we can. Again, don't worry too much about shifting between them at this point. Just take this time to familiarize yourself with what these chords sound like and feel like. Do remember that in order to make these chords work, you will need to maintain a pretty good left hand posture, and one of the main things you'll have to pay attention to is that your thumb doesn't stick out too far from behind the fretboard. If anything, your thumb should always be in the lower half of your fretboard. This will allow your open strings below the fingers you are pressing down to sound properly. A good way to think about this is to remove all pressure from your left hand by shaking it, like this, and turning it while still fully relaxed, like this, and adding the guitar into it from above, like this. Your left hand should never rest on the guitar, ever. Rather, it should be added, the guitar should be added from above in order to ensure ease of access to every string and fret. In addition, each one of your left hand fingers needs to be arched up nicely like this, not collapsed like that, in order to allow the open strings underneath to sound. These two issues, the thumb being too far up or your fingers being collapsed like that, are the #1 problems I encounter when teaching beginners. So please pay particular attention to avoid those. Now for our next exercise, we don't actually need to play any of these chords, although given that we've just learned them, I highly encourage you to actually go ahead and play them as well. This exercise will ask us which one of these two chords are not in a dominant tonic relationship. So all of them except for one are a progression from a dominant, from the 5th scale degree of a key, to the tonic, the 1st scale degree of a key. Use the knowledge you've just acquired and the markings on the chords you have above them to identify which chords you are dealing with and to calculate which one of them is not a dominant tonic sequence. Now, how do we go about identifying which one of these is not a dominant tonic relationship? The way you do that is by identifying the key we are in. That is the most important thing. For this, we need to identify all chords. Given that you have the names of chords written in the exercise right above that, that should be no problem. One way to do this is to get a piece of sheet music paper. This is any sort of paper that has the 5 lines of a musical staff printed onto it. You can actually go online and look this up and print it out for yourself before you start writing into it with a pencil. And one way to do this is to copy the chords from the exercise onto that piece of paper and label them. Some sheet music paper will be included in the accompanying PDF to this course, so I strongly encourage you to print that out and use that for all of these theoretical lessons. Now that we know the final chords of each bar, the only thing left to do is for us to identify where their dominants are. Let's say that we've identified the last chord in a bar to be a G major. If I want to find the dominant of that, I will count up from G until I reach number 5. G, A, B, C, D. Now I know that the dominant of G major will be a D. So the last question that remains is, was the first chord in the bar the dominant for the key expressed by the second chord? For 3 of these examples, that will be the case. For one of them, however, that is not the case. Identify which one that is as part of your homework for this lesson. Now, for our next exercise, 3D, we will be practicing our ability to change between different chords without going out of tempo. As we've seen before, some of these changes, like for example from E major to A minor, are going to be very easy and straightforward, but others will require a little bit more practice. That being said, considering that you've already learned these chords in the past few exercises, there's not much that you can do about this right now other than just practicing these changes until they work quickly and smoothly. So let's go ahead and do that. The progression I've selected for you for this next exercise is known as the folia progression or the folia harmony. It is one of the most productive harmonic progressions in the history of classical music and certainly the history of classical guitar. It is deeply associated with Spanish music and has been used by so many composers throughout the ages as a basis for their pieces, but also especially for a lot of themes and variations, such as Mauro Giuliani, Fernando Sor, Manuel Maria Ponce, and many others. And in the key of A minor, which we are going to play here, it will sound a little bit like this. Repeat. As a side note, this is technically only the first half of the folia progression. There are so many versions of this progression around, which is normal for something that has been used for so many different pieces of music by so many composers throughout the ages. But generally, the most traditional folia progression has a very similar second half with just very small changes in it. I do think this is the most important part, so this exercise basically contains the gist of the folia progression as it is. The most important thing in this exercise, as I was saying, is to keep the tempo steady and not introduce any unwanted rests between the changes of chords. This might take a little bit of time. It is perfectly normal for this not to work immediately, so do not worry if this doesn't work from your first try. It can take days or even weeks for things that involve so many fingers to settle down. Just make sure you practice and keep working at it, and I guarantee that sooner or later you'll be able to make really smooth chord changes and make this exercise sound really beautifully. Now for your optional challenge exercise this lesson, try to play this short excerpt from Edvard Grieg's really well-known suite Peer Gynt, namely the movement In the Hall of the Mountain King. When practicing this, make sure you remember that accidentals are valid for the entire duration of a bar. That is, if you encounter, let's say, a D sharp in a bar, and then a few notes later you see a D, that sharp from the first D will still be valid. The D will become a D sharp and stay a D sharp for the entirety of that bar. All right, that being said, let's see what this sounds like. All right, that's about it for now. When practicing these, try to pay attention to the left hand technique things I told you about. Make sure your notes sound beautiful. Don't force the volume. Don't use too much force on your thumb when you play the chords. And if you have chosen to play the optional challenge exercise, make sure that all the notes and all the accidentals are in place so that it sounds more or less like what I've just played for you. Have fun with these and see you in our next lesson for some really, really fun techniques and new things that we're going to learn.